Can you tell us like a family story or legend about your grandmother that's been passed on?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked because I was wondering how I was going to weave this into it. So my grandmother, after she had married my grandfather was a very sweet man. He was a lot more, I would say, passive and easygoing. And my grandmother was 100% the matriarch. And my grandmother, because she was a nurse, kind of became the like community's nurse, especially for women. So she definitely was this figure in the community. And she was somebody who would tell little girls that you shouldn't rely on your husband or getting married to kind of get ahead. You should go and study and have your own education and find a job and, be able to support yourself. That was one really cool thing, which was kind of, unusual in the 1950s in Iran. But the thing that was most kind of my favorite legend is there was apparently this high-ranking colonel who also lived in their complex or their community. And one time he was seen beating his wife. And my grandmother found out, and she went up to him and she said, "If you hit your wife one more time, I will destroy you." Basically suggesting that she would strip him of his rank, report him, and make sure he would never work again. And at that point, he actually stopped and he was afraid of her because she had that kind of a presence and demeanor where she, was not about seeing injustice.
We actually call her grandmother Nying, which is the Chinese word for grandmother on the father's side of the family.
I call him Grandpa Foot.
We, in our native language, in Hindi, we call them Dada and Dadi.
My other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother.
Mukechru means old woman in Kinyarwanda.
I called her Safta, which is a Hebrew word for grandma.
Everybody called her Mamitita.
We called her Mima and Dede.
Grandma.
Hi, I'm Steph.
And I'm Robin. Welcome to Stories from Grandparents,
the podcast where we share stories about and from grandparents. What do you think of when you think of family legends?
I think of epic stories, and I think of epic people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And I think without looking for those stories, we ended up hearing a lot of these family legends in our interviews. So people that were sharing these stories about their grandparents that they had heard that were passed down, that were absolute legends in and of themselves. And then there were stories that just the grandparent was legendary.
On today's episode, we have a few different types of family legends about and from grandparents. Our first guest, Denise, is talking about her grandmother, who was a legend in and of herself, both for her family and the community. Part of the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast was because I actually went to your grandmother's funeral, which was enormous. She was still in Rwanda, but there was like a live feed, a video at the church.
Yes.
And there was at least 100 people at the church. And then the video feed, like in Rwanda, there had to have been like 300 people for sure.
Technically, there was like 500. The whole city and the people around the country, they all came to her funeral. She was a legend. She was so loved. She was born, grew up, married, stayed in the same city. So she was born downtown, Butare. So she knew everyone. So she was a center of feeding everyone, and she was amazing. And she was too funny. That's why when people found out that she passed away, people came to her funeral. I was like, wow. And I asked my aunt, I say, I never saw this many people for a funeral. She said, can you imagine living in the same home for over 100 years? Yes, you will know this much people. Yeah, it made sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we saw how she treated everyone. So where my mom was born, they called Tumba. That's like right beside the university and the military camp. There were some, prostitutes. They were like the little village not far from there. And we never knew because my grandma treated everyone. Like they would come to her house crying sometimes. She would feed them, she would help them. And during the genocide, one of them saved my aunt because she saw her running away from the killers and she had her in her house. And how she survived in genocide, I'm not going to say it was, I don't know, she was lucky, but the president during the genocide, the president of the republic, he lived across the street from my grandpa's house before he became president. He was like a doctor. And he made an order say, do not kill those people. You can kill the whole country except this family. So she was in the wood. They are killing everyone. And they said, no, there was an order not to kill you. Get up and go to your house. So sometimes I say her kindness, her way to live with everyone, not just her. My grandpa too was an amazing, quiet man. But my grandma was really powerful. It's not like people did something wrong to deserve to die. That's not what I'm meaning. But some people recognize her kindness. And yeah. And after the genocide, it was even worse. She became like Mother Teresa for everyone.
Yeah, because that's what was coming out so clearly, even though the funeral was very French.
Yeah. Yes.
I was not understanding a ton.
Yeah, Rwanda mostly. Yeah.
Was just that it sounded like she became such a community figure after the genocide.
Yes.
And the amount of people that leaned on her over the years.
So she technically raised every single orphans. There were so many orphans in the country. And she picked up every kid from her family, from my grandpa's family, from people on the street. And she became like a mom for the whole city. Like you will come, cry, and she will be there for you. She will feed you. She paid for people to go to school with nothing, but she will give everything she had.
Our next story from Emmanuel is a story that he's learned from his family about his grandfather, and it's a rather epic cinematic tale.
Today, Transylvania belongs to Romania, but for most of history, or recent history anyway, it was its own region, and it belonged to Hungary, and it belonged to Romania, and there were transient populations that went through there, and so Transylvania has always been a really unique place in that regard. And there's a really great story that was told to me by my father. It was told to me many times, and unfortunately, I don't even understand every detail or remember every detail with perfect accuracy. But it's a real story, that's for sure. And so the story is that when my grandfather, so his name was Robert Weiss, so he was born in 1922. And so that would mean that when the war started in 1939, he would have been, a teenager. He decided to learn to become a lathe operator. And with a cousin of his, they both apprenticed, so at the age of 12 or 13, to be lathe operators. And basically it was slavery. He was the only Jew out of 20 or so young boys who were apprenticing to be a lathe operator at one of these factories. This would have been in the, the early 30s. Maybe something like 1936, 1935. He was apprenticing with other boys who were also 12, 13 years old. And there were a few boys that might have been a little bit older. And he was the only Jew. And Jews got beaten all the time back then, just like, marginalized or small minorities get beaten all the time here. Maybe not all the time, but, it happens. That he was picked on, but not only picked on, they were really physically beaten. Jews were hated, and they were hated much because of propaganda and ignorance. A lot of people didn't realize, he was Jewish because, we know that Jews don't look any different. We know that today, but people really thought that Jews had horns and had really big noses and all these stereotypes. He did actually have a very big nose. I remember when I was a young child remembering him as a very old man in his 80s with very large ears and a nose. But aside from that, there are many people that are not Jewish with big noses. But at one point there was a fight. So at the end of the day, they would have to line up. And they would each take their turn to go in front of a sink to wash their tool. They had each their own set of tools, hand tools. And these were very precious, like a barber's, clippers or something. So he was being bullied because he was people were cutting in front of him in the line. Like, you go last, the Jew goes last. And so he stood his ground and he said no. And they said, okay, well, you'll see after work, You'll see. And so it ended there. And a few days or weeks later, I don't know, they cornered him outside of work in the street or something. And so he had a physical fist fight with this guy who was 17, so he was older. And the way the story is told is that they were, it's like almost like in a movie. They were, fighting, very hard and rolling on the ground until finally they decided that there would be a truce. And he said, okay, you know what? I respect you now. You know how to fight. And so can we call it a truce and be friends? And so they agreed. And from then on, it's a little bit like when you go to prison and, you beat up the strongest guy. Well, he had a better time. But years later, after he had been sent to the camps and survived, and after he had escaped the camps, because he did escape, or his camp was liberated, but even though it was liberated, the whole area was still under, Nazi occupation, and it is still very dangerous, got caught by the Hungarian army. And the war was not over yet. And so he got caught, he got put on a truck, shackled, and brought before a lieutenant, because there were officers and there were soldiers. And so the soldiers brought him before a lieutenant for, what would usually be a death sentence. And who was this lieutenant? The same guy he had fought with, years before, as an apprentice, as a young boy. And so the guy remembered him, of course. And I said, listen, I'm going to put you on a truck, and I'm going to have the soldiers drive you to the Romanian border, because Romania was not, and Transylvania, well, I'm not sure about Transylvania, but Romania was not, under occupation. It was not. It was a safe place, safer place anyway. And so he says, it's because of our history, I'll save your life. I'll have them drive you to the border. So he said, well, thank you. And so they tied him up and put him in the back of a truck, and he had a soldier drive him. And at some point on the way to the border, my grandfather freed himself from his shackles or his ropes or whatever. And he, and the story goes that he knocked out, but what's implied is that he killed that's what's implied, because people don't like to talk about this. But my father, he says knocked out. He always says knocked out, but who knows? The driver, and he stole the truck, and he went back and he filled the truck with Jews, and he took them to the Swiss embassy, and then where it was safe, and the Swiss embassy. And then he could have just stayed there, but he didn't. He took the truck out 2 more times until the truck didn't have gas, or until there was a problem, until it was no longer possible, and went back at huge peril to himself. And so he brought them. And so by the time he was done and the truck was done and everything, there were 1,000 people in the Swiss embassy, and 1,000 people in a large house. When I say a large house, I mean, I'm talking about a house. It could be maybe 3,000 square feet. I don't know how big the house was. This could be research, actually. But it's a house. I mean, it's not like a huge building, like the U.S. Embassy here in Ottawa. It's a house, probably not a small house, but still 1,000 people. To think that 1,000 people could fit in there is unthinkable. And they didn't fit in there. There was not enough space for people to lie down. You were standing up, straight. and people had to take turns to sleep, because only maybe 1 out of 10 people could sleep at any given time. And so it was, a lot of people died there, and there was not enough food for everyone, and it was cold. And even though it's not Canada, that area is cold. And so a lot of people died. And because my grandfather was in that house for a year with 1,000 people, but he survived. And why did he survive? Because he was useful. He was the only one who knew how to fix the heater. Well, he didn't know. He figured out how to fix the heater. The furnace or the boiler. I'm not sure if it was a furnace or a boiler, but it was the heating system. But it broke constantly, this heating system. It wasn't reliable. So because it was constantly broken and it was so essential for the survival of everyone, there was a little alcove, enough for one man, just underneath the boiler. And that was his spot. He had a designated spot because at any time he needed to be able to fix the boiler. And if he couldn't fix the boiler, then more people would die. And in comparison to the work camps, the Nazi work camps before, this wasn't as bad. It was bad though, but it wasn't as bad. So, and then after that, the war, ended, and he was able to leave and go to Romania.
Our next guests, Jill and Trevor, are brother and sister that we interviewed together, and they each tell a story about their grandparents.
I'm going to talk about my grandmother, Shirley. She was born in Devon, New Brunswick, when she was about 12 or 13, if my memory, sometimes over the years the date and timeline gets a little foggy. But her father, they were having Sunday dinner, and he got a call that the old DJ Purdy ship had to go through the train bridge here in Fredericton. So he just said, okay, I'm going to be right back. I'm going to borrow your bike. So he took one of his son's bikes and biked down to the train bridge. And my grandmother said they were all kind of sitting and watching, and they saw the train open, the bridge open, and they saw it close. But he never came back. So that was in May of 42, and they recovered his body. I think it was in July 20th that same year in St. John, New Brunswick, near one of the pulp and paper mills there. And I guess this is kind of one of the first legends. They said on his death certificate that I actually have a copy of, that it was a very brutal death, and there was an investigation into it for murder. They weren't sure if someone had attacked him on the bridge. They did know it went up and went down, but eventually they settled and thought that he must have had a heart attack or something and just fallen in the water.
Growing up, the legends, I guess of my grandfather in the woods. Even myself, he's passed a lot of that down to me. His guns, his rifles, his old hunting knives and hunting belt. Like, I have all of it. And actually, it's kind of a close story. The shotgun that he had given me, which I have used over the years. Well, a shotgun, it is more close range. You'd use that for like birds and rabbits, that sort of thing. He used to hunt in New Maryland quite frequently, and he happened to be out when he was younger. This was before he was married, I believe, and he was quite a ways from home. I think he told me he was about 2 to 3 kilometers from home, which gets to the end of the story. But he was walking along, and he came up on top of a hill, and he could hear like a commotion, like really loud, and he stopped, and there was a herd of moose coming towards him, and obviously, as any human being would be terrified. Especially him having a shotgun, which shotgun and a moose really aren't two that go together. So he went up a tree. The moose, he put him up a tree, and they sat around the bottom of the tree like they were walking around. And he said you could put the rifle or the barrel of the gun down and touch the nose of the moose looking up the tree at him. So anyway, he said he sat there for half an hour or so, and then he figured his only option was to try to make a shot. So anyway, he ended up shooting one of the moose and killing it. And obviously when the shot went, the other moose scattered. So he spent a little bit more time in the tree and ended up having to go home and get his older brother, Tommy. And they came back and cut up the moose and carried it on their backs 3 kilometers out of the woods. And I was always kind of, It was one of those stories you're not really sure. You know, it's like, you shot a moose with a shotgun? I don't believe so. And then anyway, he described the shotgun to a T that he hadn't seen in years. And I'm just like, well, it's the shotgun that I have. This is going to be true. So, you know, that's the kind of story, you know, the stories that happen with him is almost unbelievable, really. But it was true.
Our next guest is my friend Chris, who doesn't talk about his grandparent, but this is certainly a great family legend.
It's kind of lots of stories about my dad's side, but I feel like a lot of them are not credible.
That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not going to fact check me. Like I have a relative on that side. I don't know quite how he's related to me, but his name was Arcool. Pretty cool name, eh? I was telling my wife that if we have a son that I want to name him Arcool. Arcule. But Arcool was like apparently a very large dude. Mm-hmm. And rumor has it that he punched an ox between the eyes and knocked it out cold. It's pretty badass. But I feel like a lot of people, I've heard that rumor in other contexts. I feel like there's just a cliche thing about people punching oxes or cows or something in the face. Have you ever heard about that before?
No.
Yeah, I feel like there's stories like that. I don't know why he would do that in the first place. Like, why would you punch the ox in the face? And you got to imagine, too, that the ox was like his tractor. Like, he used the ox to plow the fields, right? So why would you punch your tractor in the face?
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you for listening to Stories from Grandparents. If you have any interest in submitting stories or if you want to participate on the podcast, please send us an email at storiesfromgrandparentspodcast@gmail.com.